A Bridge Too Far stands as one of the most audacious war films ever committed to celluloid, a production so staggering in its ambition that it nearly collapsed under its own weight before a single frame was captured. Released in 1977 and directed by Richard Attenborough, the film sought to do something almost no major Hollywood production had attempted before, to portray one of World War II's most catastrophic Allied failures with brutal honesty, stripping away the romantic heroism that audiences had come to expect from the genre and replacing it with something far more uncomfortable and far more true. What resulted was not just a great film, but a landmark in cinema history, one whose secrets, hidden compromises, and behind-the-scenes struggles revealed just as gripping a story as anything depicted on screen. The journey to production began not in a director's office or a studio boardroom, but in the calculated mind of producer Joseph Levine, a man who understood risk better than almost anyone in the film industry. Rather than pursuing the traditional route of securing studio backing and surrendering creative control in exchange for financial security, Levine devised an aggressive pre-sale financing strategy that was virtually unheard of for a production of this magnitude. He approached distributors across multiple international territories and locked in agreements before cameras had rolled, before sets had been built, before a single actor had been cast. Large portions of the film's $25 million budget were secured through these pre-sales, giving production a financial independence that most epics of its scale could only dream of. Industry insiders were openly skeptical. A war film of this ambition had never been funded this way, and many in the business doubted that international buyers would commit to something so logistically uncertain and so enormous in scope. But Levine's reputation and the sheer power of Cornelius Ryan's source material convinced distributors to take the leap, and the gamble paid off in ways that would reshape how ambitious independent productions approach financing for decades to come. The real risk was never financial ruin. It was reputational collapse. Had the strategy failed, it would have discredited not just this production, but the entire model of pre-sale financing as a viable path for large-scale filmmaking seeking freedom from traditional studio control. Once financing was secured and production began in earnest, the filmmakers faced a challenge that no amount of money could easily solve: the question of authenticity. Battle sequences of the scale required for this film demanded more than trained extras moving across a field. The production made the remarkable decision to enlist real military personnel from multiple nations, bringing thousands of actual soldiers onto set to fill the ranks of the armies depicted on screen. These weren't men who had learned to look like soldiers through a few weeks of preparation. Many carried genuine combat experience in their bodies, and that history was visible in everything from the way they moved under simulated fire to the instinctive cohesion they demonstrated when operating as units. Directors and principal actors noticed the difference immediately. There was a weight to the presence of real servicemen that no casting call or acting class could replicate, and elevated the atmosphere of every sequence they appeared in. But this authenticity came at a psychological price. The subject matter was already extraordinarily heavy, and surrounding cast members with real soldiers deepened the emotional stakes of the entire production in ways that no one had fully anticipated. The set began to feel less like a place where a film was being made and more like a genuine military operation, blurring the boundary between performance and reality in ways that left their mark on everyone involved. The historical complexity of Operation Market Garden itself presented another formidable obstacle. The actual operation involved multiple nations, deeply layered command structures, intricate tactical planning, and an almost incomprehensible number of moving parts unfolding simultaneously across several countries. Translating that real-world chaos into a narrative that cinema audiences could follow without military expertise required significant compression and simplification. Command hierarchies were streamlined. Troop movements that had unfolded over days were condensed into single sequences. Strategic layers that historians spend entire books unpacking were reduced to their essential dramatic elements. The filmmakers were fully aware that this process sacrificed a great deal of genuine historical complexity, but they made a conscious choice to prioritize emotional impact and narrative clarity over encyclopedic accuracy. The goal was never to produce a documentary. It was to capture the human experience of catastrophic failure and staggering loss in a way that general audiences could feel deeply without requiring a military education to understand. For purists and historians, this approach remains a source of debate to this day. For audiences around the world, It made the tragedy not just comprehensible, but genuinely devastating. The question of where to film presented its own set of nearly insurmountable difficulties. The obvious solution, filming at the actual locations where Operation Market Garden took place, proved almost entirely impossible. Decades of reconstruction, modernization, and urban development had transformed the original landscapes beyond recognition. Highways cut through fields that had once been drop zones. Commercial construction had replaced historic structures. The lived-in reality of post-war Europe had erased most of what the cameras needed to find. The production was forced to look across the continent for substitute locations that could be transformed into convincing period environments, and what followed was one of the most extraordinary feats of practical construction in film history. Dutch towns were replicated in painstaking detail. Bridges were rebuilt to historical specifications. Open countryside was carefully selected and then extensively modified to match wartime terrain. Every recreated space had to simultaneously satisfy demands for historical authenticity, practical filming requirements, and rigorous safety concerns. The result was a form of engineered realism so convincing that audiences never paused to question whether what they were seeing was genuine. Nothing on screen was captured at an authentic original location, yet everything was designed with such meticulous care that it felt utterly real. Among the most extraordinary construction challenges was the matter of the bridges themselves. The crossings at the heart of Operation Market Garden were central both to the historical events and to the film's dramatic structure, and yet using real bridges for filming was never a possibility. Modern infrastructure could not support the weight of period military equipment, and orchestrating controlled explosions on functioning public structures was obviously out of question from both safety and legal perspectives. The solution was to build large-scale replicas from scratch, engineered to appear historically authentic, while also being capable of bearing significant weight, and withstanding carefully staged destruction during action sequences that required multiple takes to capture correctly. These were not simple facades or miniature models photographed to look larger than they were. They were substantial physical structures built by construction teams, working in close collaboration with pyrotechnics experts from the earliest planning stages. Every bridge had to be designed simultaneously for visual authenticity and practical demolition, a combination of requirements that pushed engineering ingenuity to its limits and consumed enormous amounts of time and budget. The spectacle that audiences witnessed on screen, the sight of these structures being torn apart by explosions, represented the successful culmination of months of preparation devoted to creating something beautiful specifically so it could be destroyed. The challenge of assembling and managing the film's cast was itself production crisis of the first order. A Bridge Too Far featured one of the largest ensemble casts in film history, bringing together major international stars whose individual schedules, contractual obligations, and professional demands created a logistical puzzle of staggering complexity. Coordinating the availability of so many prominent actors simultaneously was a daily battle that at times genuinely rivaled in complexity the military operation being depicted on screen. Entire sequences had to be restructured based on which performers could be present on any given shooting day. Scenes were rewritten on the spot. The shooting order was constantly rearranged to accommodate shifting availability. Continuity was perpetually threatened by the reality that scenes intended to feel seamless were often assembled from fragments filmed weeks or even months apart under entirely different conditions. What appeared polished and coherent in the final cut was frequently the product of frantic behind-the-scenes improvisation, with every department adapting in real time to circumstances that changed without warning. The film's smooth final presentation conceals a production environment where flexibility and creative problem-solving were just as essential to the finished product as any deliberate artistic decision. Before any of those actors could step in front of cameras, they had to be transformed. Portraying soldiers convincingly requires more than costumes and memorized lines, and the film's cast underwent intensive military-style training that went far beyond a brief orientation session. The program was structured to immerse actors in the actual discipline and daily routines of military life over an extended period. Drills, formation exercises, and weapons handling became part of their regular preparation. Military advisors pushed the cast to internalize not just the physical appearance of soldiers, but the psychological reality of men operating under extreme pressure and facing genuine danger. The training's effects reached beyond individual performance. Cast members began interacting with one another differently, adopting behavioral patterns that reflected the unit cohesion and shared hardship they had been studying. This transformation was visible on screen in the way the ensemble moved and responded to one another, with a coordination and mutual awareness that felt authentic rather than choreographed. The commitment to preparation elevated the film's human realism far beyond what conventional acting techniques alone could have produced. Into this already complex production environment came an enemy that no amount of planning or expertise could fully control: the weather. Filming a war epic on location across multiple European countries meant surrendering to the unpredictability of nature, and nature proved consistently uncooperative. Fog descended without warning and obscured carefully prepared outdoor environments. Rain transformed landscapes into muddy obstacles that halted movement and damaged equipment. Wind made aerial sequences extraordinarily dangerous and forced repeated groundings of the vintage aircraft assembled for the film. Days of scheduled shooting were lost to conditions that no one could predicted or prevented. Budget constraints and the relentless pressure of actor availability meant the production could not simply wait indefinitely for ideal conditions. The solution that emerged was one of the production's most creative achievements. Rather than fighting against the weather, the filmmakers began incorporating it into their vision. Overcast skies and muddy terrain turned out to enhance the film's bleak atmosphere in ways that could never have been manufactured in a controlled studio environment. What began as a source of frustration and financial anxiety gradually revealed itself as an unexpected creative asset, lending the finished film a harsh authenticity that money simply could not have bought. The aerial sequences presented their own particular form of creative and physical danger, depicting the massive paratrooper deployments that were central to Operation Market Garden, required making a fundamental choice about how those moments would be captured. The era-standard approach would have relied on miniatures and optical effects, techniques that were well-established and considerably safer than the alternative. But the filmmakers made the decision to assemble and fly real vintage aircraft, creating footage whose physical weight and undeniable authenticity no special effects technology of the period could have matched. This choice introduced genuine danger into production at a level that no amount of safety planning could entirely eliminate. Pilots flew aging aircraft in tight formations at low altitudes, while cameras captured the action from precarious and often exposed positions. Paratroopers actually jumped from planes, replicating the experience of the soldiers the film depicted, with safety measures that were carefully considered but could not eliminate the inherent risks of such operations. The footage that resulted carried an immediacy and a sense of real stakes that audiences could feel even without being able to explain precisely why it seemed different from conventional war film spectacle. Every aerial sequence was filmed on the edge of a tightrope stretched between the desire for a breathtaking authenticity and the absolute necessity of ensuring that no one paid for that authenticity with their life. Embedded within the production from pre-production to the final days of shooting were military advisors whose authority extended into virtually every department. These were not consultants brought in to verify uniform details and then politely ignored. They held genuine influence over how scenes were blocked, how actors moved through space, how tactical situations were staged, and how entire sequences were structured to reflect authentic military behavior and decision-making. Their input was rarely overruled by creative personnel, and when a formation looked incorrect or a tactical choice seemed implausible, filming would pause until the problem was corrected to their satisfaction. This level of authority created occasional friction with directors and actors who felt creatively constrained, but the production's commitment to military accuracy was treated as genuinely non-negotiable. The result was a level of authenticity rarely achieved in Hollywood productions of any era. Veterans who eventually watched the finished film frequently commented on small details that general audiences would never consciously register but instinctively recognize as correct, the kind of specific truth that transforms technically accomplished filmmaking into something that feels like genuine historical testimony. The screenplay faced a particular challenge that the film's subject matter imposed almost mathematically. Operation Market Garden involved so many actual historical participants, commanders, soldiers, intelligence officers, civilians, that representing all of them individually would have fragmented the narrative into incomprehensibility. The screenwriter's solution was composite characterization, merging multiple real historical figures into single on-screen characters who combined their actions, decisions, and story arcs into unified portrayals. This approach allowed the film to represent broader experiences, without introducing an endless parade of new faces that audiences would struggle to distinguish across a lengthy and complex runtime. But it also altered the historical record in ways that troubled veterans and historians who recognized what had been done. Real individuals saw their contributions absorbed into fictional amalgamations. Others were omitted from the narrative entirely. The filmmakers prioritized emotional clarity and dramatic coherence over factual precision, a trade-off that made the film work powerfully as cinema while making an imperfect document of history. The film's handling of responsibility for the operation's failure was equally deliberate and equally controversial. The production did not approach the question of blame neutrally. Certain commanders were positioned as central figures of catastrophic misjudgment, their decisions highlighted, and their hubris made central to the film's moral architecture. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the principal architect of the operation, received particularly pointed treatment. His confidence and his dismissiveness toward warnings about the operation's risks were emphasized in ways that created a clear dramatic antagonist whose overconfidence led directly to thousands of deaths. Whether this portrayal captured the complete historical truth remains fiercely debated among military historians. But it gave audiences a comprehensible explanation for an enormously complex failure, and it fundamentally shaped public understanding of what happened in September of 1944 for an entire generation of viewers who had formed their entire knowledge of the operation for what the film presented. Among the most physically dangerous portions of production were the sequences involving water. The crossing of the Vol River was a pivotal moment in the actual operation, and the film treated it accordingly as a centerpiece of its dramatic structure. Recreating it meant placing cast and crew in genuinely hazardous conditions that tested safety protocols to their absolute limits across multiple days of intensive and physically demanding shooting. Actors in full-period military gear entered water with strong currents and cold temperatures, their mobility severely limited by equipment designed for authenticity rather than modern safety standards. Medical personnel and rescue divers remained on constant standby throughout filming, prepared for emergencies that felt increasingly likely as conditions deteriorated during extended takes. The tension visible on screen during these sequences was not entirely the product of skilled performance. Cast members later admitted to experiencing genuine fear during filming, and that authentic discomfort gave the scenes a visceral intensity that safer shooting conditions could never have produced. Throughout the production, as weeks extended into months and the emotional weight of the subject matter accumulated without relief, the psychological toll on cast and crew became a significant factor in how the film was being made. Long schedules, demanding physical conditions, and daily immersion in the recreation of catastrophic failure and mass death created a form of collective burnout that experienced professionals found themselves struggling against. Morale fluctuated across the production period. Cast members later described feeling genuinely worn down by the experience, as though the film's themes of overreach and collapse had begun to seep into production itself. This wasn't melodrama or exaggeration. It was a natural consequence of spending months recreating one of history's most devastating military disasters with unflinching emotional honesty. The film's atmosphere of defeat and loss did not remain confined to material being filmed. It spread to the production environment and shaped how everyone on set understood the story they were collectively telling. The editing process that followed months of shooting required choices as painful and consequential as any made during production. Early cuts of the film ran significantly longer than 3 hours, packed with subplots, character development, and historical context that expanded the narrative in every direction. Entire sequences were removed for pacing. Character moments that had deepened emotional connections were cut. Historical context that enriched understanding of the operation's complexity was sacrificed for dramatic momentum. Some actors saw roles dramatically reduced, their weeks of work trimmed to brief appearances. The narrative was fundamentally reshaped in the editing room, with each removal sacrificing something valuable in service of creating a version that could hold audience attention across its final runtime. What was lost exists now only in raw footage that was rarely preserved with the care modern productions give to deleted material. What survived the editing process was in terms of its visual and narrative approach, genuinely revolutionary within the war film genre. Richard Attenborough and his collaborators made a deliberate and conscious decision to strip away the glorification that audiences expected from military epics. Victory, when it occurred, was never romanticized. Successful moments felt temporary and costly rather than cathartic or redemptive. The narrative structure denied audiences the emotional release of watching good triumph decisively over evil. Confusion, fear, and human limitation became the emotional core of the film's most significant sequences. The visual language of battle scenes deliberately rejected the clarity that conventional action filmmaking provides. Camera movement avoided stability. Framing embraced crowded and chaotic images where critical details competed with visual noise. Blocking created configurations that obscured spatial relationships and produced genuine disorientation. This was not a failure craft, but a precise artistic strategy, designed to make audiences feel something approaching what soldiers actually experience rather than allowing them to observe combat from a comfortable analytical distance. Complementing this approach was the film's extraordinary use of sound, and equally extraordinary use of silence. Where audiences expected the sonic assault of explosions, gunfire, and swelling orchestral accompaniment, the filmmakers strategically deployed restraint. Quiet moments were positioned with intention throughout the film's structure, creating contrast with surrounding chaos that gave those silences enormous weight. In critical emotional scenes, music was stripped away entirely, leaving audiences with ambient sound or complete stillness that forced direct confrontation with what was happening on screen without the emotional guidance of conventional score. Composer John Addison, who had himself served during the actual operation, created a score of genuine complexity, martial themes and heroic marches that appear alongside scenes of failure and devastating loss. The contrast generating tragic irony rather than straightforward patriotic feeling. Stirring music accompanied men marching toward disaster, undercutting any impulse toward comfortable celebration and constantly reminding audiences of the human cost being paid for every forward movement on screen. The film's release prompted reactions from actual veterans of Operation Market Garden that went far beyond typical audience responses to historical cinema. Survivors who attended screenings reported being overwhelmed by the specificity and accuracy of what they witnessed. Details that general audiences would overlook entirely carry profound personal significance for those who recognize them from lived experience. The sounds, the chaos, the faces of young men confronting impossible situations, all connected to memories that had been suppressed or processed over the intervening decades. Previous war films had frequently glorified veterans' experiences or reduced them to digestible heroic narratives. This production showed the confusion, the fear, and the ultimate futility with an honesty that matched what survivors actually remembered rather than what they had been told their experiences should mean. For many, watching the film became an unexpectedly powerful and painful confrontation with buried trauma, a belated acknowledgement of what they had actually endured rather than the simplified version history had often preferred to tell. The influence of the film extended far beyond its theatrical run and its box office performance. It fundamentally altered expectations for what serious war cinema could accomplish and how honestly it could engage with military failure. The shift toward authenticity over glorification that the film championed became increasingly prominent in subsequent decades, with productions across the following 30 years absorbing and building upon its lessons. The commitment to portraying soldiers as vulnerable human beings rather than invincible warriors, the willingness to present failure without redemptive meaning, the rejection of easy heroism, all of these choices trace back to decisions made during this film's production and execution. Its influence runs through the DNA of virtually every serious war film that followed, reshaping the genre's possibilities in ways that younger filmmakers have continued to explore. And underlying all of this, the financing gamble, the construction achievements, the casting chaos, the physical dangers, the psychological toll, the editorial sacrifices, was the simple power of the film's title. The phrase, "a bridge too far," originated as a tactical assessment, reportedly spoken by a British officer who recognized that the operation's objectives exceeded realistic human capabilities. Choosing those words as the film's title transformed military criticism into a moral statement, a thematic announcement that framed everything audiences would experience across nearly 3 hours of unfolding disaster. The concept speaks to something older and larger than any single military campaign. It speaks to human ambition exceeding human limits, to overconfidence colliding with reality, to the catastrophic consequences of refusing to acknowledge what is genuinely possible. Operation Market Garden becomes, through this framing, not merely a historical military failure, but a parable whose resonance extends across centuries and civilizations. The specific events of September 1944 carry universal meaning through this interpretive lens. The mission becomes a symbol of overreach that transcends its historical moment and speaks to something fundamental about human nature and the recurring tragedy of mistaking ambition for capability. That resonance is precisely why, nearly 5 decades after its release, A Bridge Too Far continues to matter, not simply as a document of what happened, but as an honest reckoning with what it means when courage is not enough, when the best-laid plans collapse under the weight of their own ambition, and when the soldiers who bear the real cost of strategic failure deserve a truth more durable than glory.